Hi, thanks for joining me. Today we're going to discuss kind of an odd case that happened in Appleton, Wisconsin. We're going to go back to the week of September 25th, 1967. During that week, there was a headline in the Appleton Post-Crescent. It said, "Woman 80 hospitalized in Appleton butcher case." It went on to tell the story of how body parts were discovered scattered throughout Appleton, including the case got some notoriety because some school children at a school found some of the body parts in paper bags. And we're going to take a little journey around Appleton and see what exactly happened, who the people involved are, and how the case resolved.
Let's flash back to the week of Thursday, September 28th, 1967. 80-year-old Marie Schmidt of 319 North Division Street was taken to St. Elizabeth Hospital by ambulance after human body parts were discovered in her yard and in her garden. The pieces of flesh and bone were discovered in the Schmidt yard by police at 3:30 p.m. Wednesday, September 27th, 1967. Several hours later, police entered the Schmidt home with a search warrant. Mrs. Marie Schmidt was discovered sitting in the dark basement with a rope dangling over her head. More body parts found in the backyard were believed to belong to her husband, Mr. George Schmidt, age 84, a former construction contractor in Appleton. Mrs. Marie Schmidt was taken to St. Elizabeth Hospital with police outside her door. According to the Post-Crescent, she had not been charged with anything and was not being guarded. George and Marie Schmidt owned the brown two-story frame house on Division Street for about 15 years. It was located at the current site of the Appleton Post Office. Police would not label this a murder or speculate how the body was dissected into small parts. Several tools, such as saws and knives, were removed from the Schmidt home. Now, this is where this case gained some notoriety in Appleton. On Monday, September 25th, 4 first and second graders at St. Joseph's School, which is pictured, found a bag containing toes and foot flesh on the playground. 4 total packages were found at the old St. Joseph School playground and St. Joseph Church in a window well, as well as packages found of containing human flesh in a grassy ravine 500 feet north of the playground. The packages were neatly wrapped, ironically, in newspapers, mostly from the Post-Crescent. Interestingly, the Wisconsin State Crime Lab said on Tuesday of that week, so that would be Tuesday, September 26, 1967, a human liver was found near St. Joseph's School on Monday, and that held an, quote, unknown non-metallic object resembling a pellet. Authorities were told that the object could have penetrated clothing before entering the liver, but police would not speculate as to the possibility of a shooting. So to bring this into 2020, we are approaching the former site of the St. Joseph's School where the children found the bags of toes on the playground. On the right here is where St. Joe's School used to be. It is now the Fox Cities Exposition Center. St. Joe's School was torn down in maybe the year around 2000 or so. In that ravine down there, the children would play at recess. Okay, so now we're on the opposite side of the street. What you're looking at is St. Joe's Church. So in a window well, Mrs. Schmidt would have dropped off packages of her husband's body, mostly toes and pieces of leg and arm neatly wrapped in packages of newspaper. So that is St. Joe's Church. I didn't see any window wells when we were driving around, but that is St. Joe's Church where the body parts would have been dropped off. And that is on the opposite, or I believe, north side of the street from the school, which was on the opposite side of the street, next to Jones Park. So this is, if you see that church steeple towards the left, now it's kind of in the middle, this is a back view of St. Joe's Church. So you'll recall if we go in chronological order, the body parts were discovered on Monday, September 25th of that week. We are now going to explore what was discovered on Tuesday of that week. Mrs. Schmidt is still not been approached about this at this point. Okay, we are now driving down North Division Street in Appleton, near the Appleton Post Office, near the Schmidt residents. So if we flash back to September 26, 1967, a Tuesday, so that's one day after the packages at St. Joe's School were found, 2 packages containing human flesh wrapped in newspaper were found in the bushes in front of a vacant house on North Division Street, 2 blocks north of the Schmidt house. This house, according to Google Maps, still appears to be standing. We are driving down that street in this video. The packages contain large chunks of flesh believed to be from a leg or an arm, as well as ribs. The packages were found after police were called to investigate a boarded-up home because there were reports of children playing there at 11 p.m. After the Tuesday night discovery of the packages at the abandoned Division Street house, police further canvassed surrounding neighborhoods. While they were searching on Division Street, a detective spotted a 16-inch long bone in the backyard garden of the Schmidt house. Another package containing human flesh, possibly from the upper part of a leg, was also found there, tied in a package neatly with nylon string. So at this point, we need to flash back. We're going to go back to September 15th, 1967, 2 weeks about from when we're talking about finding the body parts. Mrs. Schmidt had called the police at that point regarding an argument she had with Mr. Schmidt. Just to establish some ground rules, according to police, Mr. Schmidt was reported to be in poor health and was rarely seen outside his home. So Mrs. Schmidt called the police, reporting that Mr. Schmidt was tipping over chairs and that he was, quote, drunk. And she also told police that she felt he should be committed to, quote, a home. Mrs. Schmidt was informed that she would need to take necessary steps to have her husband committed. Police attempted to contact a judge who was out of the office at that point, and that judge would have been consulted regarding the preparation of papers to have Mr. Schmidt committed to Winnebago State Hospital, which is about a 25-minute drive from Appleton in Oshkosh. It was much easier to have people committed back then. So the detectives were about to call the judge again, but at that time, Mrs. Schmidt had already changed her mind about the matter and asked police to leave. So during that September 15th visit, following Mrs. Schmidt's call, police observed Mr. George Schmidt. He appeared to be unable to care for himself, but all was quiet when they left. Okay, so back to the discovery of the long bone at 319 North Division Street, the Schmidt house. Discovering that bone gave police enough evidence to acquire a search warrant. So they did show up to that house, and that is where they found Mrs. Schmidt sitting in the basement with a noose over her head. They had gone back to the residence under the pretense of questioning Mrs. Schmidt regarding the September 15th incident, sort of a follow-up to see if the issue had been resolved. So the police went in, and according to them, the Schmidt house was covered with newspapers, and there was a very strong stench. And at that time, Mrs. Schmidt continued to provide police with kind of some vague answers, conflicting information about Mr. Schmidt's whereabouts, even saying that some woman picked him up and took him to Milwaukee. Regarding that search warrant, a pathologist at St. Elizabeth Hospital, a Dr. James Urkel, identified that piece of bone from the Schmidt house as being human. So that was enough evidence to get that search warrant where they found Mrs. Schmidt. They did call an Outagamie County judge, Gustav Keller, at 10 p.m. He came to the courthouse to hear behind closed door testimony that lasted about 50 minutes in order to get that search warrant. They also heard from the Schmidt neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Godfrey Belair. They rented the apartment above the Schmidts in that house. And at that time, even before the search warrant was obtained, Sergeant Gary Kilby of the Appleton Police Department had already ordered 10 picks and 10 shovels from the city shop. Police detectives went to the Schmidt house to awake Mrs. Schmidt. That's when they found her in the basement, and she was sent to St. Elizabeth Hospital. So that night, police dug up the yard by the light of flashlights. That must have been fun. And roped off the yard and found some evidence as well as additional body parts. And they gathered evidence, including numerous tools. A police officer was seen carrying a box of small bottles out of the house. The yard digging, which started behind the garage, lasted until 3:30 a.m. And each part of the body that they would find, they would unearth more parts of the body digging in the Schmidt garden. They placed those body parts in plastic bags and then put those bags into small wash tubs. So we are back to going up and down Division Street. Calls continue to come in from a lot of neighbors and people that live nearby finding clothes, knives, and bloody newspapers in their yard. In a Post-Crescent article from Thursday, September 28th, multiple neighbors reported Mrs. Schmidt leaving her house that Sunday, so Sunday earlier in the week, clutching a floral print shopping bag with wooden handles. Mrs. Schmidt was clad in an ankle-length dress, and she made multiple trips up and down Division Street that day. Neighbors described Mrs. Schmidt as always acting somewhat odd and not neighborly, recalled she was very active that Sunday and Monday of that week, going up and down Division Street with her shopping bag. Mr. Schmidt was seen last 2 weeks earlier in his yard. He appeared not to be able to walk around his backyard. Neighbors also reported that for several nights that week, the Schmidt lights in the basement were on all night. Now I know what you guys are thinking. Where is Mr. Schmidt's head? So later that Thursday afternoon, after searching the house and Mrs. Schmidt being sent to St. Elizabeth Hospital, Police Inspector John Gosh found Mr. Schmidt's head wrapped in cloth and newspapers while walking back from 319 North Division Street, the Schmidt house, to police headquarters, which was not far away. The head was on the ground between a Quonset hut used as a garage in the northwest corner of the Post Crescent parking lot, kind of where this video freeze-framed. That's where his head was located. There was a dry cleaning establishment to the immediate west, which I'm wondering is the TV and appliance store that is located there now. So at this point, a couple weeks have passed. It is now October of 1967. Mrs. Marie Schmidt is still at St. Elizabeth Hospital, not really talking too much, in a catatonic sort of state. Judge Urban Van Susteren, who you may know as Greta Van Susteren's father, appoints the husband of Mr. Schmidt's niece, a C.W. McCoy, to be Mrs. Schmidt's guardian. Coroner Bernard Kemps says he can now release Mr. George Schmidt's body to McCoy, who can make funeral arrangements. The body has been at the county hospital since returning from the state crime lab in Madison, or what's left of the body. At that point, from a Post-Crescent article dated Wednesday, October 11, 1967, authorities were awaiting a report on microscopic examination by the state crime lab to determine if Mr. George Schmidt died of natural causes. And the building that you are viewing is St. Elizabeth Hospital in Appleton. From a Monday, October 23, 1967 edition of the Post-Crescent, it has an article on the details of how Mrs. Marie Schmidt is committed to Winnebago State Hospital. Mrs. Schmidt had still been at St. Elizabeth Hospital all this time, and again, our Judge Urban Van Susteren ordered the commitment following a hearing in Mrs. Schmidt's hospital room. 2 doctors, including a psychiatrist, helped conduct the hearing. Mrs. Schmidt was committed for an indefinite period and was to be kept there until the hospital superintendent ruled that she had regained her sanity. If criminal charges were brought forth in connection with the death of Mr. Schmidt, another hearing would be conducted to determine if she was competent to stand trial. Interestingly, in another hearing, there was property obtained from the Schmidt house on Division Street, which was released, which included about $6,000 in cash and change, which was quite a sum of money back in 1967, a gold wedding band, a 1957 credit card, a, quote, George Schmidt contractor calling card, as well as marriage papers for the marriage of George and Marie Schmidt, dated October 2nd, 1937, as well as divorce papers of Marie Magdalene Malika and a Herman Malika. Marie Magdalene Malika was Mrs. Schmidt from April 20th, 1936. A family record book written in German, as well as a birth announcement for a son to the Malikas. Interestingly, to note that Mr. Schmidt's body was found shortly before what would have been their 30th wedding anniversary. So I want to add some perspective of Division Street. This is where the Schmidt house stood. You'll see the police officer in the roped-off Schmidt yard. To the right of the photo is the Schmidt house. I don't know who that lady is talking to the police officer, but I want you to observe the St. Joseph Church steeple in the background of that photograph. So that would be facing St. Joe's Church with the Schmidt house off to the right on Division Street in 1967. So here's the same spot in 2020. Observe once again the St. Joe's Church steeple. Sorry about the guy in the picture. So this picture is taken actually from the drive-up mailboxes at the Appleton post office. That's about where the Schmidt house stood, maybe a little further back, but I just wanted to give you some perspective. So if you do drive up to those post boxes, those like drop-off letter boxes at the Appleton post office, that is about where the Schmidt sidewalk is, according to what I can calculate. So we are back on Division Street. We are approaching the Appleton post office, those collection of parked cars off what you can see. I'm thinking that would have been the area of the Schmidt backyard where Mr. Schmidt's body was discovered. We are now going into the turnaround where the letter boxes are, like we just discussed. But I'm thinking, I believe, where their house and yard would have likely been and where his body was found would have been near this area back behind there where that parking lot was. At this point, we're going to flash forward 2 years. I'm referencing a Post-Crescent article from Tuesday, February 25th, 1969, and that tells of the death of Mrs. Marie Schmidt. At that point, Mrs. Marie Schmidt had been transferred from Winnebago State Mental Hospital to the Outagamie County Hospital, which you are seeing. That big empty field that we're approaching right there is the former site of the Outagamie County Hospital, which has been torn down. Mrs. Schmidt had transferred there on November 28, 1968. It is not determined why Mrs. Schmidt was transferred to the Outagamie County Hospital, but Mrs. Schmidt did die there on February 14, 1969 at 6:20 a.m. from coronary thrombosis. She had been in excellent health up until the time of her death, even being a candidate to be placed in the Golden Age home there. And this is what the Outagamie County home looked like at the time that Mrs. Schmidt would have been a patient there. So at that time in 1969, the two-story Schmidt house was abandoned and it was to be razed in the summer of 1969 for the Appleton post office. Construction of the Appleton post office was delayed until 1974 due to President Richard Nixon's moratorium on new federal projects as a tactic to halt inflation. Okay, we are approaching the final resting spot of George and Marie Schmidt here at Highland Memorial Park Cemetery in Appleton, Wisconsin. All the gravestones are flat here, as far as I can tell. So we lucked out a couple weeks ago and just happened to stumble upon it. It's near the front of the cemetery. There's a big water tower kind of opposite it, and it's near right where you walk into the cemetery. And this is the final resting place of George and Marie Schmidt. You can see when we pan around, we are near the front of the cemetery, and that is Richmond Street in the background. So there was a article in the Appleton Post-Crescent from December 27th, 1999. That was kind of a recap of strange events that happened in Appleton. And they discussed the Marie and George Schmidt butchering case. And the conclusion was it was never really determined if Marie had murdered George and then butchered his body, or if he died of natural causes in the home and then she didn't know what to do. So then she chopped him up and scattered him around town. Chances are, due to her mental state, she never would have went to trial anyways. Well, thank you for taking the time to watch my video. I really appreciate it. Just looking back at what an odd case this was, if this had happened today, it would be all over the news, all over the media. My mother lived in Appleton at the time. She would have been like a young teenager, 13 or 14. She does not have a whole lot of memory of this case. And she says, well, it sounds vaguely familiar, but she doesn't seem to recall too much of it. So kind of strange, but thank you again for watching, and may the Schmidts rest in peace.